Episode 2, Evan Peikon. Welcome to the Oxidative Potential Podcast, where we discuss all things sports science and performance. I'm your host, Matthew DeRoche, and with me is my fellow co-host, Phil Batterson. Enjoy. Hey folks, today on the podcast we have with us Evan Peikon. Evan is the chief physiologist and bioscientist at NNOXX, which is a wearable biosensor company that is coming out with some pretty innovative stuff, which I'm interested to see. You can find Evan at Evan_Peikon on Instagram, last name spelled Peikon. You can also find a lot of Evan's information out there, like on Substack, for example, Emergent Performance Lab. I've read all of those articles and they're super, super solid. A lot of really great concepts being, explained in a very, very interesting and novel way. And also there's a lot of stuff that Evan has really, really whittled down, whether it's with NIRS or other things, and provided us, the practitioner or the athlete, with some really good things to implement in our own training and practice. You can also find Evan's courses on Moxie Monitor. He does a really good course on NIRS on there. And also, I believe it's the Training Think Tank website. They have an education platform, and Evan's done quite a few courses on there, which I've went through as well, which are all absolutely fantastic. So tons of places there to find Evan. This is a really great conversation, very wide ranging in topics. Like we discussed genetics, we discussed programming, we discussed development of the athlete. We discussed CrossFit, endurance sport, getting outside of your educational, basically home, talking about branching out into other fields. There's a lot of really good conversation in this, a lot of really interesting, novel analogies. What I really like with Evan is even some of the things that you may have already come across, he explains them in such a way that honestly it takes on a new meaning almost, and you start to see things a little bit differently. So yeah, and there's so much stuff in this that Evan is really, I consider one of the people that is a pioneer in exercise physiology, because he does a really good job at uncovering some of the responses to training that a lot of people that have been around reading in the field and in the field for a long time that haven't really taken in consideration. So Evan, I consider one of those guys that really goes out there and carves his own path. So hope you guys enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and we'll catch you later. I gave you a slight introduction in the intro, but what I'd like if you could do us a service and just give a brief overview of where you are now, how did you end up there, kind of the steps. Maybe start off with maybe your athletic career, because most of us get into this type of realm through our own journey of trying to make it somewhere or improve performance, whatnot.
Yeah, totally. So I have a unremarkable athletic career as a middle distance runner.
Yeah.
That clearly didn't pan out for me. But I was interested in experimenting and dabbling, and that was a big part of how I ended up doing what I'm doing today. So coming out of college, I worked for a company called Training Think Tank, where we worked with a lot of top CrossFit Games competitors. I also had a stint of trying to be competitive at CrossFit. Also didn't work that well for me. so you won't be hearing too much about my athletic career.
Yeah.
But I spent a few years working with a lot of the top CrossFit Games competitors. We've had a handful of podium athletes come through our doors, worked with a lot of the top teams. And that's really where I cut my teeth, getting into physiologic testing and really coaching with athletes one-on-one. As I kind of phased out of working with TTT, I started my own company, Emergent Performance Lab. And while I was working on that, I was an applied physiology consultant for a handful of US professional sport teams. I also worked a lot with military special operations. And I also worked as a scientific advisor for a few different sports tech companies. And now these days, to kind of bring it full circle, I'm the chief physiologist and bioscientist at a tech company called NNOXX, and I work on biosensor development and analytics.
Which is it's a super interesting field because there's been a lot of takeoff in this space now over the last few years. Because when you look at exercise physiology and the technology involved with that, it's been stuck in this phase of lactate, metabolic analysis. Now the stuff with NIRS coming off and sample rates going through the roof, and we're seeing so many new things come through the doors in regards of technology, which is really cool. And I remember hearing on a podcast I just listened to the other day with you on it, you were talking about some of the technology you guys are working on in your company, and it sounds, whatever it is, I have no real guesses, but it sounds insane. So that's pretty cool. So moving off of that introduction, it actually kind of lines up with the first question I have, which is the misapplication of data for training intervention. Now with CrossFit athletes, physiological testing isn't this well established, protocol centered thing that people run to whenever they join a CrossFit gym to become a games athlete, right? It's not like running where you're like, oh man, I want to figure out my VO2 max, or cycling, lactate. All these things are kind of ingrained in the culture for the most part, much more with cycling. But with CrossFit, it's this kind of new emerging field. And with that, someone that spent so much time doing physiological testing, you would obviously have a lot more experience understanding the misapplication of certain data to CrossFit, right? Because even with simple things, I'll kind of end on this, even with simple things like I see with heart rate, I see this all the time, the misapplication of heart rate, and people seeing a lower heart rate corresponding with, the same output or maybe even a higher output. And they're like, oh, I'm getting fitter. Let's slam on more load, which realistically, we know that, 95% of the time that is a vagal response, right? Increased vagal tone. And that's actually, if you look at like the Lambert's submaximal cycling test, this is the basis around understanding overtraining and overreaching, right? Is that heart rate coming down? Can they not get their heart rate up? So give us kind of a view of some of the things that you see in the field of CrossFit, or it may even be performance metrics. People mistaking that, oh, this went up, then I must be getting stronger. Or if I get my strength up, I'm going to be better in endurance.
Totally. So I could think of a few. I mean, man, there's so many different misapplications of data for training intervention. One of the ones that I just thought of while you were talking about heart rate is that people often don't know the range of error for the tools that they're using. So there may actually be like a plus or minus 2% margin of error on the devices, and people will take 0.5% changes in these measurements and mistake them to be meaningful in one way or another. And it's like, man, that's just the variation of the device. You're literally just making decisions based off of noise right now.
Yeah.
But assuming we have like really robust measurements, there's no margin of error on them. I think some of the biggest mistakes I see, one is an over-reliance on proxy measurements, and this could go in two different ways. It could be using performance as a proxy for physiologic changes. So I've seen a lot of times people say your performance on a 2K row is a good predictor of your VO2 max, or your 10-minute assault bike for max cals is a predictor of VO2 max. That's one way. Could also go the opposite way, which is using physiologic markers as a proxy for performance, i.e. your VO2 max went up, you're going to be a better athlete. And there's issues with both of these. Using the performance data as a proxy for physiologic changes
Mm.
I mean, think of how many different things influence performance. The
Yeah.
2K row is not just a test of
Yeah.
your VO2 max. There's tons of other physiologic markers, let alone the fact that your willingness to suffer on a given day, whether
Exactly.
you slept well, if you're hydrated, these things are all going to impact performance. So an athlete could conceivably have a huge improvement in their VO2 max, not get better at a 2K, or they could get much better at a 2K and have made no changes to their VO2. If we take the flip side approach, VO2 max is a measure of performance. There's a lot of things like economy that impact performance. So your VO2 might go up and you might not get any better at your sport.
Mm.
So I think ultimately it doesn't mean that proxy measurements aren't useful. It's just understanding how they relate to the thing that you actually want to influence. So if you're trying to make a certain physiologic change or you're trying to make a certain performance change, understand how the marker you're measuring really correlates with that and what their relationship is. And then you could hopefully not get steered in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Yeah, just taking a broader view and keeping your finger on the pulse of how these things change. And with specific athlete, like you just mentioned there, VO2 max going up and not improving performance. I think it was Jem that educated me on the name of this, like the Simpsons paradox, I believe he called it, which is a very common one that everyone's kind of heard of. Paula Radcliffe increasing her VO2 max, her VO2 max was decreasing later on in her career, and her performance was going up.
Yeah.
But the performance was correlated with her running economy and also her lack of flexibility. So the decrease in mobility, her sit and reach test, right?
Mhm.
And this is where people are just kind of like measuring things that they misapply, like, oh, I should be getting more mobile. And it's like, well, how applicable is that to your sport? Is the required ranges accessible? If they are, okay, well, do we need any more? But yeah, it is a really good point, because with CrossFit, I think a lot of people kind of I don't think there's a ton, obviously, like we talked about, a physiological testing in CrossFit, which is unfortunate because I think a lot of people would gain from more of it. But they take these performance metrics and they say, oh, I must be getting fitter. My 2K row went up, right? The amount of, and because these people are only doing these activities, for a brief period of time throughout their week, the chances are that their fitness is going up that quickly over just building coordination and rate coding, intramuscular coordination. All these things are going up. That's most likely what it is. So it's good that you kind of brought the thing together of saying we got to take all things into consideration.
And mentioning Simmons paradox, that's such a big one. I mean, using VO2 is a really easy marker. Like if your VO2 is 80 milliliters per kilogram per minute and mine's 50, like you're going to kick my ass on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But if we're both sitting at 75, it's a complete toss up. So within a group of elite athletes, all of them pretty much have the same physiologic markers. So within that group, they're not good predictors of performance.
Yeah.
But across heterogeneous groups like beginners, intermediate, advanced, they're good markers. And that's exactly what we saw when I was working with top CrossFit Games competitors. During a 1-year period, I tested 10 of the 30 males at the CrossFit Games, and these are kind of spread across podium all the way up to guys at the back of the pack.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that all of them pretty much had the same markers on every measurement that we tested. So you're like, why is this one guy getting second at the games and this other guy's 28th? It's not their VO2 max or lactate threshold or any of these efficiencies, a big part of it, but it's all of these other factors that are either harder to test in a conventional lab setting or these other psychological factors, tactics, pacing, things of this nature.
Yeah, that's interesting because I've always thought about this. Let's say a CrossFit athlete was to engage in specific VO2 max training, right? Like they were going to go from 60, they're going to spend 2 years on increasing it, seeing if they get it up into the 70s. Obviously, there's no real connection there. There needs to be a sufficient VO2 max, but the amount of time it would take to get that VO2 max up, I wonder the decline on all the other qualities would decrease so much that, that would be a moot point, because to me, I wonder like how, if you could just put someone at an 80, mils per kg per minute VO2 max as a CrossFitter, do you
Mm.
think keeping the same qualities that their performance would not increase? But the reason that we can't do that is just because of the decrease in qualities that it would
Mm.
take to get there. Do you think if they had an 80 mil, um,
Yeah. I think there's a point where some CrossFitters do have excessively high VO2 max values,
really?
but I
Okay.
don't actually think that that's a good thing
Yeah.
because there's a trade-off. At some point, further improvements in VO2 max are actually coming with a decrease in efficiency.
Economy. Yeah.
So it's a seesaw effect. You can't have the highest VO2 max and the highest efficiency. There's actually a really awesome case study on Oscar Svensson,
Oh,
who has the
yeah.
highest VO2
Yeah.
max ever recorded.
Yeah.
And what you actually see is as he trains and his VO2 max goes up, his efficiency decreases. And as he
Yeah.
detrains, his efficiency improves.
Hmm.
And you see that to a less exaggerated degree with other endurance athletes. And it explains the Paul Radcliffe effect as well.
Yeah.
Over 5 years, VO2 max is going down, but her
Hmm.
running speed at VO2 max is getting faster and her efficiency and economy are significantly improving. So I think with the CrossFitter, most of them are already horribly inefficient.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think if you really put an even bigger engine on them past a point, they become even less efficient and they just end up outstripping their oxygen supply so quickly. So it's that necessary versus sufficient. Like you probably need at least 60 milliliters
Yeah.
per kilogram per minute. I'm pulling this as like an arbitrary number, but is having 78 going to be better? Probably not. There's going to be some point in that range where a given athlete's going to optimize things for their own body. And I don't think there's enough data to necessarily know where that tipping point is because you think of the total number of games athletes that have done this testing.
Yeah.
Maybe it's 50 over a 5 year period.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not really a robust data set.
Yeah. Yeah, that it's funny that you say that because when I do think about it and I think about the development of a CrossFit athlete, my concept is that coordination and economy are probably the two biggest factors, right? Like we've seen that in several events where they had this new event and the person that is simply the most coordinated, they may be the worst athlete on the field, but the individuals that is the most coordinated at that event, takes it home, right?
Yeah.
And it's just a time factor, but that is a good point. Yeah, the Oscar Svensson thing is a good. I'm sure you can find actually Evan has an article on it with when he talks about mitochondrial uncoupling and these things and efficiency. And it does a really good point that this guy with this massive VO2 max, right, pretty much highest ever recorded, didn't really make much of a career in cycling at all. Yeah. And we've seen that with the Nike breaking too. If you actually look now, I never actually found Kipchoge's VO2 max. I've heard Phil Skiba allude to he was somewhere in the middle of the pack within that data set, which I think would have been in like the high 70s, somewhere in that low 80s. I think that was the middle of the pack.
I've been told it was around 78 milliliters per kilogram per minute by people that have seen his data, but I don't have a specific like endpoint measurement. Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously we know there's tons of athletes with much higher capacities than that. And we obviously know the ability doesn't always translate. There's so many factors. So moving out of that, let's go into something that I'm really interested in. I don't actually hear a lot on is I've heard you discuss before that when you would send out these training blocks with athletes, you would do them in much more micro cycles over these, larger macro cycles. You would essentially keep these 2-week blocks fairly similar from week to week. You change certain things, but this gave you a good ability to track, progress and also track response, which I think is super interesting because I don't know if you read the Niels van der Poel training manifesto, or have you heard of it?
Is this the speed skater?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah, exactly.
I've heard of this. I haven't actually taken the time to read it yet, though.
Yeah, so essentially he just lays out the same exact week over week. I think the first block, I want to say he did for 15 months, which is like 35 hours of cycling. and
Mhm.
it's the same wattages on each day. And then
Mhm.
he moves into more threshold work, and it's the same exact workout.
Mhm.
And obviously, with the adaptation principles, people are like, oh, you got to constantly throw in these extreme variations and Louis Simmons, and everything has to be different every day, or you're not going to respond.
Mhm.
And I mean, that's a gross oversimplification of Louis' stuff.
Mhm.
Rest in peace, Louis. But you took a very kind of opposed view to that and said, hey, if we keep things the same, we can actually, if we keep things similar, we can actually monitor what's going on with the response of this. We can say, hey, did we actually keep improving? Are we still getting something out of this? And why are we changing it unnecessarily if we're, still getting gains from this? And
Yeah.
that's something I really don't see. People just want to change for the sake of changing because someone said something about it, and not really.
Yeah, so it's funny mentioning the speed skater. I have a friend that I ran with in high school, and he went on to have a much better running career than I did. I think at his best, he was running a 3:53 mile.
Yeah,
And this is like 10 years after we graduated
it's
high school.
insane.
I asked him, like, what are you doing for your training? And he's like, I'm doing the same workouts that we were doing a decade ago. And I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, I've basically been following the exact same training plan that we did a decade back. And I've just made minor changes when I've plateaued. So
Yeah,
he's literally been running the same workouts for 10 years and just getting faster and faster at them, making minor tweaks and iterations.
yeah,
So if you were to look at his training plan, you're like, man, that's pretty much what you were doing when you were 16 years old, just adding a little bit more volume. And it's funny because that's largely how I've trained athletes in the CrossFit space. People get into CrossFit because they love novelty.
mhm,
But the irony is that if you have so much novelty, you actually have no idea what's getting you fitter
yeah,
or not. So you're always kind of shooting in the dark. So the way that I tend to train things is you mentioned the rotating split, because with CrossFit athletes, there's so many different things that you need to train that if you
mhm,
just try and slam it all into a 1 week period, you're just going to start running into mechanical limitations, athletes' bodies breaking down. So the way that I tend to program is with an A week split and a B week split.
mhm,
So you do an A week, then you do a B week. Those are two different splits. And then you come back around to an A week, and then B weeks. So you're always going A, B, A, B, A, B.
mhm,
The way that I try to set the training plan up is within an A week and B week rotation, athletes are pretty much hitting everything that is relevant to the sport. And you're just adjusting the priority on some things more than others based on their limitations. And we're always making minor tweaks. So the way that I always think about this is that progressive overload is a sign of adaptation, but it's not the driver of adaptation.
mhm.
So the way that we're always taught about progressive overload and strength and conditioning is kind of backwards. You always hear this Milo the bull analogy,
Yeah,
that Milo carries the bull up the mountain, the bull gets bigger, so Milo gets stronger.
yeah,
And it's kind of nonsensical. If you think of progressive overload in that term, it's you increase the weight beyond what you could lift so you could get stronger and then lift more. You're like, what? You're lifting what you can't lift so you can lift more? No. If you're able to progressively overload, it means you have already adapted from the stimulus. That's
yeah,
why you're able to lift more. So progressive overload is the sign of adaptation, not the driver. So if someone's able to progressively overload, they're adding more weight to the bar, they're getting faster on their 400 meters splits, what have you. I don't change anything. I'm
yeah,
literally just going to have them do the same exact workouts until they plateau. And then when someone stops progressing, I do what's called taking the next logical step. It's making the smallest possible change that you can
mhm,
to start getting them progressing again.
yeah,
Sometimes it's as simple as adding one extra set of 200-meter repeats, and then people start progressing again for weeks. Other times it's pulling a specific training protocol out of their rotation and then putting something else in. Maybe you have to rearrange the week a little bit to account for those changes.
mm,
So essentially, the long-term changes to their training are really just functions of always taking that next logical step and making micro adjustments over time. The way that I think about it is like building a house. There's a construction site near where I live, and I walk by there with my dog all the time. So if you go day to day and you look at the house, you're like, nothing has changed whatsoever.
yeah,
Even week to week, sometimes I walk by there and I'm like, oh, it looks pretty much the same as it did 2 weeks ago. Then all of a
yeah,
sudden, one day you walk by and you're like, what the hell? This looks nothing like it did 6 months ago. When did these changes occur? Because I walk by here every day and I think the place looks exactly the same. And now suddenly it's a completed house when it was stud 6 months ago. That's how training within my program works as well. Day to day, week to week, month to month, you may only notice the slightest changes to the training split. But then if you project out over a 6 month or 12-month period, athletes are like, oh, I'm doing a completely different training split than I was a year ago. But if you look back over the whole arc of their training, there's really no defined point when you could pinpoint where the training changed.
Yeah, this is, I think this kind of reminds me of a lot of John Kiley's work, where if people aren't familiar with him, he's kind of been a big proponent of shifting the perspective around these traditional periodization models. And he's done a good job at really putting himself out there and saying, I don't know the best way, but I just know that this thing that we're all putting up on a pedestal isn't the necessary answer. Which he actually gets into a lot of stuff that I've always had thoughts about in terms of hormones and the endocrine response from an individual, how much they believe in a training program. And I've always remembered this because I remember coming across some research on forced exercise with mice versus voluntary exercise, and the responses to that are quite different.
Yeah.
And thinking to incorporate that into training, like I always used to say, like I know if I believe in this, that I will get better adaptations. So I would literally have these crazy things going on in my head about what was going on in my body when I was training.
Yeah.
And I used to think of this as some type of like, secret edge I was getting out of it. But I do think there's so much missed and why people adapt from specific training protocols. And people just throw so much noise into the mix that it's not even possible to understand what people are actually adapting to, especially when you're taking something like CrossFit. It's so insanely noisy to begin with. And then people want to make it more noisy by saying more variation, more variation. Well, yeah, you're going to get good. You're doing work, but are you going to be as educated in the process 5 years down the road and understanding all these little things that made those big clicks, made those shifts, and how your body responded and adapted from those? And I think that's just the big difference, is understanding. And we'll get into this after, is question I did want to talk on the difference between some of these kind of perspectives on developing an athlete, where people kind of shoot for this quick result versus, taking your time, maybe cutting a few years off of your initial career to take more time to develop so you're ready to get there. And I see this with other sports that's just not taken into account with CrossFit. But yeah, anyways, John Kiley, great work. And you're probably into some of his stuff as well, right? I'm guessing.
Yeah. So I haven't kept up with him in recent years, but yeah, I mean, years back, John Kiley was a huge influence. And it's funny that you mentioned him, because every time I've talked to someone who will talk about periodization or training plans, and anytime I've like really vibed with someone and we're speaking the same language, it's always this question of like, have you read John Kiley? They've always read John Kiley. So it's kind of funny that you mentioned him.
Yeah. It's people got to figure out why these things, like go back and read the it's funny with Russia. I'm up to like 11 o'clock at night reading these Russian journals anyways. And these people are nuts. These people are absolutely nuts. Some of the research that they're putting out, and people are like, oh yeah, Russian research, they're not doing anything. I'm like, I can tell you for a fact, the stuff that they're researching right now is way further. Like, they were doing stuff back in the 70s that we will not repeat into the, it's just, they're like the intricacies of arm wrestling, like the nerve conduction signals. They're testing, they're doing stuff that we're just not even thinking about. And they're big into the developmental process. Like, when I go through the journals, there's probably, I would say 50% of it is on athletic development as children, and how these children respond and develop in specific ways. Why do they think that? How do they break this model? How do they pull it apart? But yeah, it's just about thinking about things different. The reason why I pulled up Russia is because these guys were taking massive amounts of drugs back in the day.
Mhm.
And that informed a lot of these deload weeks, their training
Mhm.
cycles to be the way they were. So if people, and not only that, like the whole seasonal periods of
The lack of sunlight in the
ex-
training halls.
exactly,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. It's like,
I love that. It's like an American coach went in, learned from them for years, and came back and brought block periodization back to the West. It turns out once they invented UV lamps, they completely figured that out. They're like, oh, it's
yeah,
just we didn't have vitamin D for 6 months of the year, but people still train with those methods here.
yeah. No, it's good. I'm glad to hear a little fresh air on that. I don't hear it too often. So let's move into some of the popular myths and misconceptions in sport performance and training for sport. Like
Mhm.
one of these things that I've actually I remember really warped my head around it. I think it was back around, it was probably around 2015, 2016. I was listening to this podcast, Robbie Bork. I don't know if you heard him, All Things Strength and
Yep.
Wellness.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Good
yeah.
friend of
You
mine.
were on that. You were on that podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I talk to Robbie
Yeah.
all the time. He's a really good friend.
Yeah. Yeah. So he had Fitzgerald on, James Fitzgerald,
Mhm.
first winner of the CrossFit Games back in the day. And they kind of had a little brief, back and forth on Robbie saying, well, if we, build strength, our, 10, 8 rep max, 20 rep max is going to go up. And James gave him some pushback. He's like, no, that's not true. And I was like, what? This guy's out of his mind. Of course it is. Because back then I was still kind of in the whole Louis Simmons, you got to squat
Yeah.
800 pounds to run a 40. And
Mhm.
anyways, and then Robbie's like, what are you talking about? This is just against the laws of how, response works. Of
Mhm.
course, you're going to get you're going to get more endurance from lifting more. And then it really never clicked in with me until I started thinking about some of the stuff when I came across your work about occlusions and thinking about not only that, but the coordination and adaptations of the neurological responses of
Mhm.
lifting higher weights does not
Yeah.
always transfer over. So this is kind of like a setup for maybe some of the things that you've seen out there where people just kind of hold these pillars of, increasing your squat by 50 pounds is going to give you a better 20 rep squat max, right? Like it's just,
Yeah.
there's a lot of things out there that are kind of counterintuitive. And I don't know if you've come across.
Yeah, I mean, so if we go years and years back, there's this big idea in the CrossFit world. Maybe this is still a big idea. I don't know. I don't really uh, keep too up to date with popular training ideas, but particularly when Outlaw was a big training camp,
Mm,
everyone had this idea that if you could squat more, deadlift more, bench press more than everyone else in CrossFit, you're going to wreck them in Metcons. So
mm,
you would see CrossFit athletes squatting 550 pounds, snatching 300 whatever back in the day when that was still considered crazy. Now that's just kind of the standard.
mm,
But then you would have an athlete with a 300-pound back squat just completely destroying a 550-pound squatter in a workout with wall balls and
mm,
thrusters and all of these different movements. And you're like, what is going on? It was confusing as hell to me at the time because I wasn't a particularly strong CrossFit athlete. And my whole idea was that if I could squat 500 pounds, I'm going to start destroying everyone. Well, it turns out that it doesn't really matter what your 1 rep max is. It matters what load you start restricting your own blood flow at. So you could have someone that squats 500 pounds, but they cut off their arterial blood flow at 50% of their 1 rep max.
mm,
You could have another athlete that squats 300 pounds and they don't cut off their arterial blood flow until 90% of their 1 rep max. The athlete that squats 300 pounds and isn't restricting their own blood flow and creating a tourniquet out of their own muscle tissue is
mm,
going to fare much better at a workout with high volume squatting. Because at the end of the day, in CrossFit, in most cases, we're dealing with very light loads. It's
mm,
20-pound wall balls, maybe 115-pound thrusters in an open workout if you really wanted to push the load up. And even that's not super common. So is there really utility in squatting 600 pounds? Probably not. You're going from a weight being what, 20% of your 1 rep max to
yeah.
15, not really moving the needle that much.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I realized over time is strength is only important so long as it actually allows athletes to lift the weight. If there's 225-pound squat queens in a Metcon, yeah, it's not going to be great. If you squat 240 pounds, you're not going to do very well. But when we're dealing with these lighter loads, it really matters what your occlusion threshold is, because that's going to determine whether or not you're able to get steady blood flow to the tissue and whether you're getting sufficient supply of oxygen. So just that kind of frame shift for me was something really significant working with these athletes, because I stopped thinking of strength as a goal in and of itself. And strength was only important so long as it allowed athletes to lift the actual weights that were being used in competition. And once they get that check mark, I stopped caring about getting their strength higher. For most CrossFit athletes, unless you're at a games level, if you're squatting 400 pounds, probably don't need to train your squat anymore. You're much better off trying to improve your occlusion threshold. And that's actually going to have much more carryover to performing well in the sport.
Yeah, it's sorry, it is quite funny, because this is one of the biggest rabbit holes I went down at a certain period of time. I was training for this thing in the military back in the day where, anyways, there's a certain requirements for the screening. And I just I honed in on one thing because I want to understand the process better, right? I was reading a lot of Pavel back in the day, Pavel Satsaline and these guys, Greasing the Groove. And I was kind of thinking, like, I think this is more so the answer. Like, I wanted to see how many push-ups I could do in 2 minutes, or just max push-ups in general. And I kind of discussed this with one of the guys I was living with who owned a gym at the time. And he told me that, if you want to increase your push-ups, you have to apply as much load to the tissue as possible, engage as much motor units as possible, and this is going to make you more efficient over time. So I went down this rabbit hole of creating all these different variations of loading push-ups and creating maximal tension, doing all this stuff. And my push-ups just kept going down and down and down. And I was training push-ups pretty much every other day. I kind of went away from the whole Satsaline thing, Greasing the Groove. And I just gone into this focused program of getting push-ups up, because my other stuff was fine. It was going to pass. And I just kept getting worse and worse. And it didn't make sense to me until it was actually John Kiley's work that pulled me out of that. And he talked about this motor unit enslavement. And when you start doing the same neurological pattern for an exercise over and over again, it's going to start capturing that more and more and more into the exercise, no matter when you do it. And what I realized was, because I was actually being quite inefficient, because I was creating so much maximal tension. People say, yeah, the more motor units you apply to the lighter load, the longer you'll be able to do it because you're using less. But it was actually the opposite. I was starting to occlude so much that within, 60 reps, I had gone down to 60 reps now that I could do that. I was pumped out of my gills. And realistically, what brought me out of that was understanding, how can I achieve this with using the least amount of motor units possible? And also, how can I cycle motor units while doing this? And this is what I realized later on in life. This is what cyclists do. This is what runners do. Really effective, economical runners and cyclists, they're consistently cycling their motor units. They're slightly changing their position. They're creating some movement variability in there. And that helps them to create this endurance of what we see on the time boards and these things. But which is something that kind of wants to push me into this concept coming off of this, is critical lift and critical power. I don't know if you've heard of this, but this kind of fits in really well when we're talking about, raising our 1 rep max doesn't increase endurance, but how can we find this thing that kind of fits the model of understanding how well we're improving our performance over time through testing? And I know you were a big proponent of using critical power, critical speed, and these things in CrossFit back in the day. And now coming out with this critical lift, understanding the curve response to loads and reps. Do you think this could serve as a useful marker moving forward and profiling an athlete in between blocks as a test, right?
Yeah, so this is something we had played around with a few years ago, was getting critical lifts on a lot of the main lifts that you would use in CrossFit. And you would be able to plot this out and see where the asymptote is, and essentially what is the load that this person could sustain nearly indefinitely. And what you find is, even for very strong athletes, the loads are like minuscule. You have a guy that's a 500-pound squatter, and you're like, what is their critical load on a thruster? And you're like, it's 35 pounds. Really? 35 freaking pounds? Like, you're never going to see that
Yeah.
weight in a Metcon.
Yeah.
So that's when you realize you could even model this out, and you go, okay, so what happens if I get their squat up 50 pounds, and you look, how does this impact critical load on a thruster? And you're like, oh, it brings it up to 38 pounds. Excellent. Like, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
But then when you start playing with the different parameters in the model and you see what actually brings that y-intercept upwards significantly, it's not bringing their absolute strength up. It's improving their ability to preserve their reps at lower loads and bringing the floor up over time. Where, I mean, some athletes, it is bringing their absolute strength up, but you could model these things out. The one thing that started to become impractical for this was that it just takes a lot of time to do this for each individual lift. So we had played around with ways of just capturing training data. So if people are doing Metcons anyway, and occasionally they're doing max unbroken sets, just pulling those data points and refitting the curves with that, it just became a data limitation. Didn't have any software engineers at Training Think Tank that could make something that just pulls metrics from their training log. But yeah, I think it's a really valid concept. And the really interesting thing is, you think of a lot of the gymnastics movements in CrossFit, and when you think of the critical loads for those, oftentimes they're negative loads. So you're like, okay, well, your critical load on a pull-up is minus 35 pounds. Like, good luck being able to sustain chest to bars indefinitely. And you find that the best CrossFitters, they actually approach body weight for their critical loads in a lot of these movements. One of the most impressive feats that I saw was years back, we had Travis Mayer. I think he was doing like 200 wall balls for time at 30 pounds. And we were like predicting, like, how many is he going to go unbroken? Did the whole thing unbroken. And it turns out, when we had looked a while later, his critical load on squats was like through the roof. So that's where you see people being able to string together these ridiculous sets of movements.
That's absolutely amazing. Yeah, it's funny because it's the model is quite simple to work with. It's just a little bit of a task to get these, because critical power testing, it is quite inconvenient, even whatever sport you're doing it in, right? But I think the curve gives a really good profile for an athlete without having to get on a metabolic analyzer or, whatever, NIRS, or even, you know what I mean? Actually, NIRS is much more, I think, would be a little bit more useful in some cases for profiling quickly. But yeah, this for people with no technology out there trying to understand how their profile changes to training and training interventions, I think it will actually become quite a useful model in the future. Hopefully we see more on that. The research is so small on it right now, but it'd be interesting to see how that changes. So one thing I wanted to move into was training and the physiology of elite CrossFitters. Like we kind of brushed on that briefly earlier, which was, the VO2 max needs to be, sufficient. Like, I think you put the terms before, it needs to be sufficient, but it's not, required to have these massive capacities to compete at a certain level. But moving into maybe some of the NIRS profiles, which we didn't really touch on yet, a lot of people might not be super familiar with, is, I know you've spoken recently, and Evan has some great courses out there, guys, and great content out there. If you want to understand more on this, but understanding the difference between these kind of two typical phenotypes that we see pretty much in every sport, where you got this, parabolic curve, this quote unquote aerobic athlete for those out there, and quote unquote anaerobic athlete, where you see these dramatic onset kinetics, right, of desaturation. If you want to kind of just go into that and maybe discuss a little bit of some of these typical profiles that you see and how people accomplish the same task, but in two different ways physiologically.
Yeah. So at the top level in CrossFit, man, it's hard. Like, you do see two very different phenotypes, but they're also similar in that they share more characteristics than they differ in. So one of the really common things with high level CrossFit athletes is you really almost never see them lacking in their ability to utilize oxygen in the peripheral tissues. They're usually pretty good utilizers. If they could get oxygenated blood into the periphery, they're going to be able to suck it up and utilize it for energy production. But where they're typically limited is either their cardiovascular function. I actually think more in terms of their ability to dilate blood vessels than I do their cardiac output. I really do think cardiac output is more of a secondary quality, where like you usually see cardiac output accounts for 90% of inter-individual differences in VO2 max. I actually strongly disagree with that.
I agree.
Cardiac output could only increase by about tenfold from rest to maximal effort exercise, where blood vessel radius is raised to the fourth power, could increase by multiple hundreds of orders of magnitude, probably impacts peripheral blood flow to a much greater degree. The issue is that if you don't have good cardiac output, your brain won't let you dilate. So I think of that as one phenotype, the person that either can't dilate in the periphery or they're capable of dilating, but their maximal cardiac output isn't good enough to maintain their blood pressure, and then their brain sympathetically vasoconstricts them. I call those people delivery limited athletes. Then we also have another main phenotype with the high level individuals where they have good oxygen utilization, they have good peripheral vasodilation and blood flow, they have good cardiac output. But by virtue of being so good at all of those things, they end up creating a respiratory limitation, which is almost like the deterministic limiter if you're really good at everything, because the respiratory system is really unique in that it really doesn't adapt very well to maximal effort exercise. So when you look at elite endurance athletes, their cardiac output is so much higher than the ordinary person. Their oxygen utilization is so much higher. And then you look at their pulmonary system function, you're like, oh, you have the same pulmonary metrics as this dude who's been sitting on a couch for 10 years. Interesting. And in fact, there's actually a lot of instances where elite endurance athletes have maladaptive remodeling to their pulmonary system. So it essentially ends up happening, these athletes' cardiac output is so high that their red blood cells move so fast through their pulmonary capillaries that they can't actually pick up oxygen. And these athletes just end up delivering deoxygenated blood to the periphery.
Diffusion limitation, right?
Yeah, diffusion limitation. I think of it like a Amazon delivery truck like goes to the warehouse and the people that are supposed to load up boxes are getting ready and the truck just doesn't stop moving. They're like trying to throw boxes into the back of a moving truck, and the truck leaves the factory and it's just half empty. It just doesn't have packages in it, and then it goes to people's houses to drop off nothing. That's essentially what's happening in these individuals. And that's probably the most common type of limitation that I see in the really top CrossFit Games athletes. You look at some of their peripheral oxygen saturations, and they're getting down to like 85% at maximal effort exercise. Sometimes you'll hear them talk about their fingers and toes going numb, or you'll see their lips turn blue when they really push themselves. So that's kind of like the physiologic phenotype. But then I think what really differentiates people is their ability to regulate tension and handle training volume. Because like we said earlier, they all pretty much have the same VO2 maxes. Their engines are just as large, but their efficiencies are grossly different between people. And this could be like their length tension relationships or just their ability to handle training volume. You think of someone like Paula Radcliffe, where she's improving her economy really late into her running career. Think of how many thousands of foot strikes she's getting in a given week and how many miles she's racking up over the years. You think of that total amount of work volume that it took to improve her economy, and then take any single movement in CrossFit. The top games athletes haven't done even a fraction of that volume of squatting, handstand push-ups, chest to bars. So part of the reason why they're all horribly inefficient at almost every single movement that they're doing is that they just haven't been able to do enough volume to develop efficiency. And I think this is partly why the best CrossFit Games athletes are just able to handle an insane amount of training volume. That's really the requirement to become efficient. So you have this like elite physiology, and then you layer on the ability to handle a ton of training, and that's what makes someone such a good CrossFit athlete. I honestly don't think Rich Froning or Matt Fraser's VO2 maxes or lactate thresholds or what have you or that much better than the athletes that are in 15th or 20th. I think it's just they could do more work before they get injured.
Yeah, it's funny because not to throw Matt Fraser under the bus here, but people think that it's his training that won him the CrossFit Games, right? He releases hard work pays off kind of training. So, and people are going to eat that up thinking that that's going to improve them. People kind of miss the point that Matt spent years at the Olympic Training Center doing Olympic weightlifting. And a lot of people have never actually been in Olympic weightlifting gym for even CrossFitters, right? And they don't understand how many front squats, how many snatches, how many clean and jerks that these people have exposed themselves to, whether it's with a broomstick, a bar, all those things combined. They've even taking one of those. I bet you Matt Fraser's probably done more snatches with a broomstick than most people have done snatches with weight on the bar in their life, right? So, I mean, people fail to recognize this very simple fact that he spent so much time in this space.
Yeah, and to speak of like the utility of work over time, we actually had a coach at Training Think Tank. I'm not going to throw anyone under the bus here. It's probably the freakiest athlete I've ever seen. He wouldn't submit his scores for the open, but he would regularly be in the top 5 in the world on these events. And he would beat Noah and Travis and all these people in the open workouts. And I remember asking him one year, I'm like, dude, why don't you submit your events? Like you would easily go to the games, because he would even do the regional workouts back at our gym at TTT, and he would put up scores that would smoke all of the athletes that were actually competing at regionals. He's like, I have no volume tolerance. He's like, yeah, I could put up one amazing workout every week in the open. But he's like, if I go to regionals, I can't do that much work. He had a lot of really gnarly injuries from like his prior sports career. So he had the physiology to put up these ridiculous scores, but his volume tolerance just wasn't up to par. So you would have games athletes who were clearly not as talented as him. They couldn't beat him one-on-one on a workout. But if you were to do 5 workouts in a day, they end up smoking him just because they could take the beating. And that's something that really stuck with me, because I realized, even looking at our own body of games athletes that we had regularly coming through the doors, there were a few guys there who, putting them through testing, seeing them work out over one weekend, I'm like, man, they're clearly much better than these other games athletes who are consistently ranking in the top 10. But these guys would get injured every other month, so they would never be able to put in a long enough training block to really reach their potential.
Yeah, that's it. That's a huge thing that just, I think people kind of throw out with the bathwater is they completely misunderstand people's capacities to handle volume and load at certain competitions. Like, for example, it was the same, like you'd see people, whatever sport it is, whether, let's take climbing, for example, right? Someone that's a great on-siter, but they can't red point, right? Because they don't have the endurance to sit there at the crag and rep after rep after rep. They have a couple of good goes in them at most. Or whether it's in fighting, I'd see this all the time, where guys were absolute world beaters in the first round. Half the second round, that starts to deteriorate. And then in the third round, if they're in the third round, they're done, right? And it just, people fail to realize the capacity that's needed to compete at the CrossFit Games. Yeah, a lot of people out there might smash some of these individuals on one-offs, but realistically, big part of their characteristics that make them succeed is their ability to handle load over time. And it's funny because when we're talking about that too, I train in Thailand for a bit, and these guys would come in half drunk and smoking cigarettes, and they would gas us within 2 minutes of a round, and they're sitting back there absolutely chill as can be, bringing their lunch pail to work kind of thing. And people don't realize, like, endurance a lot of the times comes from, yes, having the tissue qualities, but also, like we were talking about earlier, these guys have spent decades doing the same thing over, like Paula Radcliffe, like Matt Fraser, doing the same thing over and over again. And this is what I used to see back in the day. Some of the best boxers in the world used to be chain smokers, right? Like Nicolino Loche, Argentinian boxer, great, one of the best defensive boxers all time, used to chain smoke in between rounds in fights. and he had some of the best cardio you've ever seen. But it's because he was so efficient in his movements, spent so much time there. It's just, yeah, it's a point that people, I think, miss.
Yeah, and combat sports really exposed that. I used to wrestle for years, and my wrestling coach, he was like in his mid 40s, didn't really work out. And he would wrestle with us. All of us are young guys, and he would just kick our asses. And you'd think,
Yeah,
like, oh my God, this guy's in insane shape.
yeah,
But then we would go for a run with him, and you're like, wait, he could barely run with us and keep up. You're like, what the hell's going on? You realize you're like, oh, when he's wrestling, he's literally not doing that much more work than I am
yeah,
walking right now because
exactly.
he's so efficient. He wrestled for 20 years. He was a multi-time national champion, was on the Olympic team.
Yeah,
So you're like, wrestling is just walking in the park to him. It's so ingrained that he literally does not have to expend energy in those positions.
yeah,
But then you see them run and you're like, oh, okay. So
yeah,
it's not their conditioning. And you could
yeah,
apply the same thing to CrossFit. You're like, again, is anyone just taking a walk through the park when they're doing thrusters or wall balls or burpees? No,
yeah,
no one's done anywhere near enough volume to really get to that point.
yeah. It's so true, man. It's funny because I think anyone in combat sports has had that experience to some degree with a coach or like a washed up, athlete that comes back in the gym after like 5 years off and dusts
Yeah.
everyone. Yeah, that's just it's funny because it brings back a lot of good memories. Um, let's move into this is like really something I wanted to get into is development of an athlete. And we can talk about CrossFitters, we can kind of swing this into anything,
Mhm.
but I think like where I'd like to start with this is just because I think a lot of people don't even think about this really. They don't think about the trajectories and possibilities from the training interventions that they're applying, directly to the athlete. And I remember hearing it, back in the day. I said this with a podcast. I think it was with Jem, or I can't remember who it was exactly, but I remember hearing, I think it was Verkhoshansky that was saying, like, if you apply plyometrics to an athlete too early, you're going to destroy them. You're going
Yeah.
to ruin their full potential. And I was like, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. What do you mean? It's plyometrics. It's plyometrics. And then it really took the time to learn is because once you start a wheel rolling,
Mhm.
that wheel continues to roll for the most part, that people keep implying that. And if you build certain qualities before other qualities, you are inherently in the long run going to degrade from that athlete. So the way I like to think of it is if we start, building up an athlete and we start applying load too early. For example, let's just take Olympic lifting because this will work really well with Olympic lifting. Imagine if someone walks into an Olympic lifting gym and they start applying, 135 pounds to the bar to learn Olympic lifting before they start with a broomstick.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're going to be able to lift 135 pounds and they're going to be able to snatch and clean to a certain degree. And they might even be competitive out of it.
Mhm.
But in the long run, we know that that athlete is not going to be served well
Mhm.
by the addition of that weight in the beginning. And I think I see this all the time with athletes that get into CrossFit. It's fun, it's competitive. They just keep applying the load, they keep applying the stimulus, and they never take a step back to actually build these qualities like the guys that Matt Frazier, the guys
Yeah.
like Rich Froning that have already spent years building before they went into this conditioning. And they
Mhm.
focus way too much on conditioning, which is something that is fairly easily grasped, right? We can attain conditioning fairly easily. It's not easy to build an aerobic base. It's not easy to build a strength base. And when you apply that conditioning realm to it, now like Tiger Woods changing a swing, you're going to have to take 2 years off basically
Mhm.
and hope that you can get something out of this,
Yeah.
application that you change your swing, right? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on this or.
Yeah, I mean, I think this concept is far reaching. Like anytime if you start someone on advanced protocols and you skip the fundamentals, you're just hurting their ability for long-term progress because at some point you're going to need to do more intensity, more load, more volume. So you could think of this in terms of the motor skills, like you were just explaining, or even starting a beginner athlete with too much total work, because at some point they're going to plateau and you're not going to be able to give them more volume or more intensity forever, where you might be able to start them on a very small amount of work and actually see good progress. and holds them there as long as you can, and eventually they plateau and you up the load, and you could do this over a multi-year trajectory. Imagine if they just start with a moderate training volume already. One, they don't need that to adapt, but now that's the minimum threshold for improvement once they plateau. A while back, I was working with some professional bodybuilders doing consulting with them, and they said something that really struck me at as kind of odd at first, but it makes sense in light of this as well. So these were professional IFBB pro bodybuilders, humongous human beings using meaningful amounts of androgenic steroids. One of the things that they were saying is they were talking about this younger bodybuilder who's up and coming, really large individual. And they're like, he started on gear too early. They're like, he's too big. Like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, isn't the entire purpose of your sport to get big? And they're like, it is, but they're like, if you start on a high amount of gear, yeah, you're going to get big. But what happens when you plateau? They're like, the best professional drug using bodybuilders get as big as they possibly can without using a single drug, max out that natural potential, then use a very small amount of drugs, max out their potential, and increase over time. And it's a kind of funny way of looking at it, but the same idea applies to training volume, intensity, or any variables. If you just start kind of like pushing the max, you're kind of screwed when you plateau.
That's probably the best analogy I've heard on that, because I've heard that in the bodybuilding space, because you have these two camps of people just smash as much gear as you want, and then you hear these other people talk about, it's the minimum effective dose is going to get you where you want to be. Bodybuilding field has actually got people, obviously you don't have to do drugs, folks, PEDs to learn from bodybuilders, but if you go in and listen to some of the discussions that some of these guys are having, or some of the content that some of these guys put out, it's actually quite informative, helps you, pull a lot of these concepts together around training for anything and adaptation for anything, right? Because they are really close to that, adaptation response when it comes to hypertrophy and all the things that go into that, the way that they think actually, can stimulate some good thought. But yeah, because where I wanted to put it on that is, there's only, when we talk about, we're talking about economy, because thinking about CrossFit and economy, it's such an important factor. And I think if you ruin those patterns in the beginning, if you for the sacrifice of some quick term results, you are going to limit yourself. We already talked about the energetics, but the coordination wise too, it's like, to work yourself back from where you are to try and relearn again, it may never happen for you. You see this with runners that pick up these, specific habits, or sprinters for sure. Like I've heard Charlie Francis talk about this. People have these specific compensation patterns that they carry into their sprinting. And if you try and go and change that, because that is their limiting factor, like you think that is, maybe it's not, but you try and change that, you will completely ruin that athlete and they'll never come back from that. And I just think that it's like any sport, they all kind of follow the same rules. You have to walk before you run, and CrossFit just seems to, I love CrossFit because it's the most, it's kind of the greatest unsolvable question in exercise physiology, right? Like, how do you make a good CrossFitter? It's impossible. You know what I mean? It just depends on the year. But we kind of like to think that there is these things that are overlying principles that if you can, apply the proper patterns in the beginning and then build from that. And it's no different really than any athlete that's reached, really high highs. They've done it probably the proper way, whether it's shooting pucks in the backyard before going out and playing, 20 games a week. They've got really good at the process of just shooting a puck and handling a puck in the backyard. And I just think CrossFit kind of misses that point. But so one thing I want to talk to you about, because I don't really hear people in the exercise physiology space talk about climbing ever. Andre's done some research on it, and I hope to talk to him in the future and talk a little bit about it. But climbing is this kind of other field where, I've been into climbing for a while. I don't climb much anymore, just don't have time. but there is so much misconception surrounding climbing.
Mhm.
And also, like, you know, even some of the best stuff out there, like some of the Anderson brothers put out a book, Training for Climbing, if people are familiar with that. They're very, very basic, but I think there's a lot of misconceptions in climbing as well. But maybe we can just talk about you, and because I know you had some exposure to climbing, and with the brain that you have, I'd love to hear, like, you know, what you learned from climbing, what you did in climbing. Maybe just spend some time bouldering. I don't know what capacity, but did you gain anything from climbing at all? Did you look at the process of what it takes to be a good
Yeah.
climber?
So ironically, one of the things that really struck me with climbing, it's really the opposite of CrossFit in some ways. So the CrossFitters that want to get good at like thrusters, they're always thinking get stronger, and that's going to make you better
Yeah.
versus just layering on volume. In climbing, you almost see the opposite in some regards, where athletes focus too much on volume and not enough on strength.
Mm,
But one of the things that really struck me with climbing is a lot of CrossFit athletes struggle with grip endurance. That's a well-known limitation in CrossFit.
mm,
But when CrossFit athletes try and improve their grip endurance, they go about it in a very backwards way. They lack grip strength and they just try and do a ton of volume in movements, one with a neutral wrist position. So they're almost always training with a neutral wrist, doing farmer's carries, plate pinches, all these different things. And one of the things that I learned from climbing is that, yeah, you could do as much grip endurance work as you want, but if your fingers, hands, and forearms are weak, it doesn't really matter. You could climb all the V0 and V1 bouldering routes that you want, do 50 of them in a day, and it's not going to make you a V10 climber because you're
yeah.
just too freaking weak. And you never really see athletes outside of the climbing world training grip maximal endurance or maximal strength. And I literally mean 3 second maximal effort bursts,
Mm,
max effort hangs. These are things that when I brought them into the CrossFit world, athletes that had struggled with grip limitations for years and are always doing grip work, the grip limitations disappear. So I've
mm,
had a lot of CrossFit athletes start hangboarding, uh, usually not doing true absolute strength work because finger flexor tears are a real
yeah.
issue, particularly if your hands aren't conditioned for it. But doing basic hangboarding, even 20, 30-second hangs, you can build up load on that. It makes a really big impact for CrossFitters. Also, the variation of wrist positions in climbing that you see athletes training in
Mm,
makes a huge difference for CrossFitters. Because, like we said in CrossFit, people are always training a farmer carry, neutral wrist. They're doing
mm,
plate pinches, neutral wrist. Well, what are the movements in CrossFit that athletes struggle with their grip? Chest to bar pull ups, touch and go power snatches, things of that nature. Those movements don't occur with a nice, perfect neutral wrist. The neck wrist is flexing and extending, and muscles are strongest in their mid range, not in their shortened or lengthened range. So for CrossFit athletes, another big thing has been training their grip in those other wrist positions. So if they fully flex their wrist and they kind of have their arm like a Zottman curl position, try and do a farmer carry like that.
yeah.
Even top CrossFit Games competitors are like, I can't hold a 10-pound dumbbell in that position, or
Yeah.
try and extend the wrist and put their arm by their side and hold a weight there. And again, they're holding minuscule weights. Some of these guys, when they do farmer carries, they're using hundreds of pounds per hand. Then you
Yeah.
flex their wrist and they're going down to 10, 15 pounds. So there's
Yeah.
so much easy progress to be made. So that was one of the big things with climbing for taking it back. I'm by no means like an elite level climber. So I'm
Yeah.
trying to learn many other things if I stuck with it for a long enough time. But
Yeah.
those are the big ones, things I've learned and brought back to CrossFit.
Yeah. I think it's funny because I've I was blessed with a good grip. I think it was just because you know, I always had this connection between how hard I squeezed when
Mhm.
I started training when I was young. So I always had this connection that how hard I squeezed correlated to the amount of strength or the amount of force I could output, right? So on a
Mhm.
bench press, anything I ever did, I always squeezed as hard as I could. And with having a good grip, you start to notice the advantages that you have of a good grip, especially in combat sports,
Mhm.
climb, all these other things with weight. Like, because I did CrossFit for a while too, and I remember on some of these, like whether it was pulling exercises, deadlifts, right? It felt like I literally had a hook on my hand. Like
Mhm.
grip was never. a thought in my mind. Like never
Yeah.
once did I even come close to thinking that, oh, my grip is limiting me at
Mhm.
all, whether it was on pull-ups or anything. Like to not have to think about that adds such a huge factor to your game, because realistically, we know that most people, when it comes to endurance exercise with weight in their hand, one of the biggest limiting factors is their grip. And not only that, the grip serves as this anchor point for neural drive into
Mhm.
other parts of the body. And that's what I think we understand. That's the same thing with the feet. If you try and squat with lazy feet, or you try to
Mhm.
sprint with lazy feet, those feed forward mechanisms that work up the body, you're not going to be prepared for the load that you're trying to undertake. So I think people just think of grip training, well, like, oh, I don't really care about my endurance. But if you train your grip, I believe you will be able to output more pounds or more force and whatever you're doing. It's the same thing with the feet. If you train your feet, that weak point connecting to the ground, the ankle stiffness too, right?
Yeah.
It's a point that's a focal point for force, strength, endurance, all these different things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and something that never really occurred to me before climbing. So I've worked with combat sport athletes as well, and you always hear, oh, this athlete has small hands, they're not going to hit hard. Or in
Yeah.
CrossFit athletes will say, I have small hands, thin fingers, I'm not going to have strong grip. You don't realize the capacity that fingers and hands have for hypertrophy when you actually
Yeah.
train them directly. It sounds almost silly that we wouldn't think of that, but it wasn't until really climbing and you're looking around at a lot of experienced climbers' hands and you're like, oh my God, their fingers are like
Sausages.
twice the size of my fingers.
Yeah.
You're like, either everyone here is acromegaly
Yeah. Yeah.
or doing this training is doing something.
Yeah, no, it is funny, but I don't think people have ever probably experienced that. But if you go online, you could look up a picture of some famous climber's hands, like whoever you want, and you'll notice that it's absolutely insane. Like it looks like they have, it looks like someone that's suffering from obesity and they have these,
Yeah.
massive fingers. Um, but yeah, no, it is a good point. It clicks a lot of things in my head when you're talking about that. I didn't really think about that when carrying over was the grip, because with climbing I never really focused much on, well, I did do a lot of finger training and stuff like that, but it wasn't something that I thought about applying to other things.
Mhm.
um but yeah, so let's move into like some of the stuff that you're currently interested in now, like because I know I heard you on Sean's podcast, you were talking about nitric oxide and some of the stuff that you were, which is really interesting stuff, because it's a link that I think you're gonna kind of crack the code on for a lot of people's understanding. We're talking earlier too about, vascular control, and we're talking about VO2 max, and that's such a huge factor. Like your body has capabilities. I look at it this way: a lot of training is building the structures up so we can start to push these switches back in the cycle, right? We have these switches in our body, whether it's the Golgi tendon organs, whether it's the muscle spindles, whether it's, the brain controlling vascular control, all these kind of the baroreceptors, all these different things.
Mhm.
We kind of have to break those switches, but to break those switches, you have to provide the structures underneath with the capability to be able to break those switches. I don't know if that's something you want to talk about, but whatever it is that you're interested in, whether it's nitric oxide, whatever it's, kind of glossing over your.
Yeah, so there are three things. One, to give some context right now, I don't actually work with athletes one-on-one anymore. So
Yeah.
it gives me some flexibility and freedom to kind of like dabble in these other areas because I don't really have a coaching client load. But they're very much things that I want to bring back to training with working through athletes in other capacities. So my big three, and they're all kind of connected in one way or another, are cardiovascular control mechanisms, like you had mentioned,
Hmm.
essentially understanding blood flow regulation. We don't think about blood flow that often, but ultimately that's one of the biggest drivers of performance. If you can't get oxygenated blood to a tissue, there's not much you're going to do in the way of strength, endurance, etc. And nitric oxide is a really big part of that. It's a very often overlooked molecules where we're not taught about it in school, and it really is tragedy. We're always taught about the respiratory system and this two gas respiratory cycle. You breathe oxygen in and
Yeah.
you breathe carbon dioxide out. The reality is they missed the third gas. It's actually a three gas respiratory cycle in the human body, and nitric oxide is the third gas. So when we're not thinking about that, it leads us to make some conclusions that are a little off base about how the pulmonary system functions, how oxygenated blood actually gets to the working muscle. The other big area of interest for me is exercise-induced changes in gene expression.
Mm,
Because ultimately, all that we're trying to do with training is we're trying to create a specific chemical change that leads to a change in transcription.
yeah.
So the reason why steroids work, if someone were to go down that route, is that they're working on the same signaling pathways as training would do. And it's turning switches on, turning other switches off. That's all exercise is doing. You lift a weight and you're providing a tension stimulus, and that tension stimulus is going to turn on different signaling cascades that change gene transcription and turns on genes that are going to build muscle. So I'm really interested in understanding how a given training intervention impacts different people's gene expression. You
Mm,
could actually study this. So I've been looking a lot at data sets where they'll take a blood sample from a bunch of different people at baseline and they'll do a DNA microarray and they'll get gene expression on a whole host of different genes.
mm,
One of the ones that I'm really interested in is called VEGF-A, and it
mm,
codes for vascular endothelial growth factor. That's what grows your blood vessels and capillaries in the tissue. And
mm,
this connects back to cardiovascular control. If you don't have capillaries and blood vessel growth, you're not going to be able to get as much blood.
mm,
One of the really neat things that you see with is VEGF-A gene expression is you have 20 different athletes. In one data set I looked at recently, it's all 20-year-old males, all relevant training backgrounds. And at baseline, you just see wildly different levels of gene expression. Then you have them all do the exact same training program for 10 weeks. We're talking like pretty significant training programs, not just some like half-assed stuff you see in exercise training studies, like hard resistance training, hard endurance training.
mm,
And then you look at gene expression after the study, and you see some athletes' gene expression goes down for VEGF, other athletes go up, other athletes are exactly the same before and after the training intervention. And there's so many different reasons for this. One athlete that had the highest expression before and then one of the lowest after. It's like, well, maybe what they were doing for training before this intervention was even more aggressive than what they did in that intervention. So you're actually decreasing the stimulus for blood vessel growth. Another athlete that starts low, maybe you're actually upping their volume and intensity, and that's why they're getting an increase in gene expression. So it's really interesting seeing how a bunch of different athletes could all do the exact same thing, and it's actually impacting their gene expression in completely different ways. And this isn't really practical right now. Like I wish I
right
had something
now.
that I'm like, this is how we use
Yeah.
this information. But this is something that like my dream is if in a few years you could get like a portable gene sequencer and everything's so simple. Like we could take a quick blood sample from you, have you do your training, take another blood sample 4 hours later, and we could see how your gene expression changes. You could technically do that right now. It's just a buttload of work and that's very expensive. But as these things get cheaper, you could conceivably look at how a given training stimulus is impacting an athlete's gene expression over time. And instead of having this black box of we give people training and they either get fitter or they don't, we could actually see within that box and make it opaque and understand all of this molecular machinery. And just imagine what that's going to do for training. If you literally knew how everything impacted the athlete, you could cut out everything that's not getting the exact response you want, and you could put other things in. And maybe you could have CrossFit athletes with really good economy and everything because you could just make the training so potent. So that's something that I'm really interested in. And then kind of the third big area for me right now that connects to both of these is applying machine learning to training data sets
Mm,
for predicting injury and performance and things of that nature. So by virtue of working for a tech company now and actually working on some of these problems, that's kind of the three topics that I'm working with on a daily basis.
dude. Okay. So that okay, let's get into this genetics one for a second because this is super interesting to me. The nitric oxide is super interesting, but I'll let people listen to the podcast with Sean about that because you did a great discussion with him, kind of understanding or helping people understand the misconceptions around nasal breathing, all the stuff that's out there, right? It just rattles my brain sometimes. But this DNA, the understanding nuclear genome, understanding bacterial genome, understanding mitochondrial genome. I think this, like you said, I think this is going to be the future of athletic performance. Some of the stuff that I've been really into lately is understanding the microbiota's connection to physical performance, and understanding the differences between one interesting study. Basically, I'll kind of overview it for people. Is they took groups of mice, they knocked out some genes, and had, wiped out basically the bacteria in certain mice, and they kept the bacterial genome, essentially the microbiota, intact in the other mice, and monitored the response and adaptations to hypertrophy, essentially. And interestingly enough, it had a huge impact, which started spurring things in my mind of, some of these phenotypes we see responding to a certain stimulus. How much of that is informed by, obviously we know the nuclear genome has a huge part of it, but also the bacterial genome inside the gut. I think that's a hugely missed aspect. And even talking about, like caloric harvest, these things, the bacteria you have in the gut is going to dictate how much calories you actually take into your body as to use as substrate. It's like the bacterial genome is insane to me.
I have a colleague, a lot of the breakthrough discoveries related to nitric oxide are actually his work. And in his lab, they did something similar where they had mice that were essentially living in a perfectly hermetically sealed chamber, where they stripped these mice of all of the gut bacteria, and they weren't able to produce nitric oxide anymore. It essentially knocked out their nitric oxide synthase. So they couldn't vasodilate blood vessels. They were prone to heart attacks and strokes and mouse dementia. And all that they did was clean out their microbiome. So you realize, you're like, how much of our ability to produce these different biomolecules is related to our gut bacteria, or the bacteria in our mouth. That's one of particular concern for people, is if you strip out the bacteria in your mouth, you're actually not going to get nitrates from your food properly processed. This is why if you take beetroot shots and you use Listerine prior, you're not going to get the performance enhancing effect of beetroot, because you've knocked out the nitric oxide synthesizing bacteria in your mouth. So there's all these things that are just starting to be explored, and I really think it is the complete tip of the iceberg, because we know so little about the gut microbiome. We know so little about the human brain. Now that different like machine learning platforms have been being applied to the human body, you're just seeing these insane breakthroughs come out every few months that are just like mind-boggling. Systems in the body work entirely different than anyone ever conceived. And these things are typically geared towards like neurodegenerative disease or cardiovascular disease, just because it's so expensive to run these projects and do these experiments. But as technology gets cheaper, you're going to see these starting to get turned towards exercise physiology. And I think there's going to be some craziness that comes out of that.
Because to me, like, people think, like, I hear this all the time. I'm like, there's no big secrets left in exercise physiology. Like, everyone knows how to. It's like, yes, to a degree, I understand what you're saying. The athlete has to be dedicated to the sport, put in the work, and over time they will get there. But these fundamental things that we inherently just don't understand, I think will make a dramatic shift in exercise physiology. I think, like, when you're talking, we're just talking the bacterial, the mitochondrial genome. And if anyone listening here hasn't checked out Evan's Substack, go on there. He has an article where we were talking earlier about Arthur Svensson, and it mixes in some of Doug Wallace's work, which he's kind of uncovered the mitochondrial genome is inherited from your mother, essentially. That guy will win a Nobel Prize someday for sure. Some of the work he's doing, I think. But essentially, Evan gets into the uncoupling, or the coupling efficiency of the mitochondria, essentially. So we have these things called uncoupling proteins, which essentially create gaps in the mitochondrial membrane, which leak, you know, so-called energy, right? Leak protons through, which provide the energy for ATPase, which, you know, is a nanomotor that spins around like, I don't know, 2,000 times per second or something like that. Anyways, so for you to create energy, you need these tight gaps in the mitochondrial membrane. And depending on your genetics, the efficiency of that membrane is going to really dictate how well you can perform work or how well you can essentially heat your body. So people living, that's why you see when you see Black people come visit Canada for the first time, they're like, brother, I don't understand. I don't understand. Like they're just so inherently, their body is not designed to handle this type of climate. And what their body is really good at doing is producing work. A lot of these people, that's why you see people from Kenya. It's not like by chance. Yes, we understand that the nuclear genome has a big part to play in that too. And also like their lung development, but the mitochondrial genome is such, and I remember commenting and I'm like, I'm happy that someone's talking about this because people completely miss this altogether, this factor. And I think a lot of the stuff that I've been experimenting with in terms of supplementation is really centered around the mitochondria, because I don't talk about this with much people. It's like, oh, the only thing that works is beetroot juice and creatine and caffeine. And I'm like, well, we spend pretty much 90% of our time trying to gain adaptations from the mitochondria. Why don't we spend time thinking about how can we enhance that, right?
Yeah.
How can we enhance that? Also, right, like we're vascular response, all these other things are a big part of play. But realistically, when a cyclist goes out there and trains for 35 hours a week, a lot of that has to do with the mitochondria. A lot of that has to do with the VEGF, right? Shear stress on the on the vessel. But yeah, dude, like I love hearing people's take on this, like because I go through some of these papers and nuclear genome research right now for sports performance is starting to get there. I have seen some papers recently talking about response to exercise, and it's just, I think it's on this edge right now where we're seeing stuff.
There's something I've wanted to get this data for the longest time. It's one of those projects I've just haven't gotten around to doing this in the past 2 years, but talking about the leakiness of mitochondria and how much heat generation there is per unit of work, like you said, very northern latitude populations, they have very inefficient energy turnover. They produce a lot of heat. And if you think about that from a survival standpoint, well, if you're all the way up in the Arctic Circle, do you want very tightly coupled mitochondria that don't produce a lot of heat? No, you're going to freeze to death. So you have very leaky mitochondria. There's a lot of heat production per unit of work. And interestingly, if you look at the populations with the highest VO2 max values and lowest rates of metabolic disease, all northern latitude. If you look at equatorial populations, on average, native equatorial populations have the lowest VO2 max values and the highest risk of metabolic diseases when they adopt Western diets. Very tightly coupled mitochondria, not a lot of heat production or metabolic heat production. And you look at the best endurance athletes, Rift Valley, it's not equatorial, it's not very high, it's kind of a moderate latitude where you're having slightly leaky mitochondria. So you could have these very high VO2 max values, but they're also relatively tightly coupled, so they're efficient. This actually goes back to like the 1980s. Michael Joyner was predicting who would run the sub 2-hour marathon. And he even said, he's like, the person who runs the sub 2-hour marathon will not have the highest VO2 max. He's like, they'll have a moderately high VO2 max that is totally reasonable, but they'll also have very good efficiency. And if you predict where that would fall on like a latitude line, you're like, yeah, it's roughly the Rift Valley. And you know, what you know, all the best distance runners are from there. They're in Ethiopia. So it is crazy to think about. I've wanted someone to collect a ton of population VO2 max data and also get the mitochondrial genome data and just map that out and see how that correlates. If someone has that, like, please publish it.
That would be absolutely amazing. Like that's where the data science gets into it. It's like the funny thing is, because I hear this thing, because I'm deep in the rabbit hole in physiotherapy too. And the shape of the thorax. This is something that I've been brought to my attention. I haven't found the research that dictates this yet, but I've heard several people speak on this before. Obviously, I'm sure you're familiar with Bill Hartman, but I don't know if it was, yeah, I think it was Zach Couples was talking about it, but the shape of the thorax changes throughout, latitudes. So essentially, the more northern that you are, the thorax is going to be more flattened, essentially looking like if you squish out all the toothpaste in a toothpaste tube, it's going to be very wide and flat. Whereas if you were to fill that toothpaste tube up with toothpaste, it's going to be quite round. And the reason why they believe this is because obviously it holds heat better when you have this flatter tube, right?
Yep.
Compared to doing work, right? Which is, running locomotion. A very cylindrical thorax is going to aid in the ability to rotate. And I just like the anthropometric side of things. I would love, because if you look anthropometrically at individuals, obviously a lot of this has to do with, yeah, these people are just walking more. These people are just, spending more time doing physical activity. But if you look at the development of, let's just say, the calf musculature, like the gastrocnemius,
Yep.
those end up quite high in some of these, equatorial mid-latitude ranges, right? Like if you're looking at Nigerians, more so West Africans, right? Like they have specific anthropometrics and musculature that aid in the ability to, do work quite quickly. And then moving on to the other side of that is actually, yeah, where was I going with that? Anyways, I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah, I just think it's amazing. It's amazing. There's so many things.
Yeah, I think you're basically going like based on latitude. I mean, it's not just mitochondrial genomes. There's different anthropometric adaptations as well. And I mean,
Yeah.
it makes sense if you think about like most things in biology come from natural selection.
Yeah.
So different demographics, different latitudes, different flora, fauna, they're going to select for different adaptations in humans as well. So that accounts for a lot of this variability. It's not that everyone that migrated to Northern Europe or the Arctic Circle happened to have uncoupled mitochondria. It's no,
Yeah.
everyone that went there and didn't probably froze to death.
Yeah,
People that are very
Yeah.
uncoupled at the equator, they probably had heat stroke. So the only people left are the ones that have the genotypes and phenotypes that are well suited to that environment. And you extrapolate that over millions of years, and then you have this genetic variability in the human population because we're one of few animal species that are pretty much everywhere.
Yeah.
So it is pretty crazy to think about it from that perspective.
Yeah. So let's move into final questions before we go deep down the rabbit hole, data science, and keep pushing on this. This has been amazing so far. So the first question, I think you kind of alluded to it maybe earlier in the conversation, is if you had unlimited resources while staying within the realm of, technology that is currently available or somewhat developed to us right now, if you could commercialize it and compact it to use with athletes for diagnostics, what would that be and why?
Yeah, so I'll give a caveat that this is basically what I do for work at this point. We build different technologies and compact them and scale them. I can't get into specifics of what I do. Maybe that's something for future conversation. So
yeah, for sure.
Barring anything that I actually do work on, I would do the compactable DNA and RNA sequencer. That's not something that I work on right now, so I could talk about that. I mean, I just think the applications for that are limitless for performance, medical applications, you name it. And if you gave me these unlimited resources and I could do that, I'd probably make a buttload of money as well. And that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So that is actually good. It's some of these things some of the answers on that question are actually much different than I expect people to answer on, which is nice. So we'll kind of move around here in this question bank, but can you give me a time where you've had a hypothesis or had a perception on how certain things work, whether it's in exercise physiology, maybe it's something completely unrelated to exercise physiology, and anything where you were sure that this was how it worked, this was how everything wrapped around the concept, and you were completely off course, and learn something actually quite useful from that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I could literally think of hundreds of times that I've been completely wrong about things. When I first started getting into exercise physiology, I was very sure that I knew how things worked. I'd read a few textbooks, and I knew that lactic acid was the source of fatigue. I knew that you drain the phosphocreatine pool before you start tapping into the glycolytic system and then the oxidative system. I knew these things as facts, and over time you realize that you're actually wrong about most of those things. I was absolutely wrong about all of those things I just mentioned. In recent years, though, it's less of these like huge revelations where you're just completely off base on something, and it's more nuanced changes over time, or better appreciations of how things work. So a lot of times, particularly because I spend a lot of time reading out about blood flow regulation.
Mm.
I'll I'll know how a gross process works at a macro scale, and I'll understand the different mechanics of the components involved. But then I'll realize that the reason that one of those micro processes happens the way it does was wrong. So you're like, oh shit, that little cog in the wheel is different than I thought it was. It doesn't change your overall interpretation. It might not even change what you do in practice, but it's a better understanding of this small mechanism. And I think that's a lot of the recent years. It's these really small evolutions that none of them are really that significant. But if you kind of stack these up over enough time, you're like, okay, I have a pretty different working understanding of how this process in the body functions.
That is true. It's just, I guess that's a good sign of maturity. It's where your 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 conceptions around things are much more conservative, right? You don't make these huge dramatic leaps and take these huge dramatic jumps to trying to understand things. You kind of build it a little bit by bit, and you break a little bit rather than fracturing half the thing and trying to like find yourself again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also the realization that, I mean, when I was younger, I thought science is what we use to discern the truth. And what I've really learned over time is that that's
Yeah.
not really the purpose of science. It's actually just to make ourselves less wrong.
Yeah.
So we're probably wrong about a lot of things right now, and we could just be less wrong in 6 months or less wrong in 10 years, but we're probably never going to know like the truth with a capital T. So it's also just not holding on to anything too strongly, because I meet experts in all different fields on a week to week basis. And a lot of times I'll be talking to them and you might say something and they're like, by the way, that's completely wrong. And here's why. And you're like, oh my God, like even that is wrong.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think like if you look at some of these fields for people to try and kind of give themselves a little bit of reference, go read a little bit on biophysics or like quantum biology and these things. And it's like the amount of information that we actually understand about how these things functionally work at a little level. Or like I see this all the time where people just have this blind faith in the system. Like, oh, this thing's available. It must be good because the government says it. It's like, if people actually understood how little these organizations and institutions knew about what's out there, like whether that's pesticides or it could be anything. I don't care what it
Yeah.
is, right? I'm not like, gung-ho on any one thing, but it's just like people think that the government just has this all-knowing best interest and all understanding capacity around all these little intricate things about biology to keep us safe. And it's like, if you actually read the research that's out there and understand how much we don't know, that's what
Yeah.
always scares me when I read research and I hear statements about, actually we don't understand the complete mechanism. I'm like, we don't understand this.
Yeah.
Like that's what freaks me out. It's not the fact that, oh, we figured out, and even when we figure out these pathways, 15 years down the road, we understand because the spin on the electron is the opposite direction. It's completely invalid, right? So it's
Yeah.
like,
No,
Yeah.
totally. It is shocking how little we know. Like years and years back, I worked in a lab and we studied tuberculosis.
Oh, nice.
And we spent like, I was only in there for like 6 months. That was not a thing for me. But basically, at the end of all this, they figured out like, okay, tuberculosis is so deadly because these two enzymes. It's like, awesome, we figured it out. And then I'm talking to the
Yeah.
professor and I'm like, so what do these do? And they're like, oh, we have absolutely no idea. They're like, took us the past 15 years to figure out that these two enzymes are what make it so deadly, but we have zero clue what they do. We have
Yeah.
no hunches, and you're like, oh my god, like this is freaking tuberculosis, man. It's been killing people for
Yeah.
hundreds of years, and you're telling me that you have no idea what these enzymes do.
Yeah.
And it's like that's something that's so well studied. I mean, you think of anything in exercise science, our field is only 100 years old. Like,
Yeah.
what could you really learn in 100 years? It's a lot, but it's
Yeah.
definitely not everything.
Yeah. It's so true. It's so funny. I think it's a little bit what's going on now. You see that, yeah. It's just makes me laugh. So, um, I know you're not training athletes right now with the current job you have, but let's say you had an athlete in front of you. Let's just say they're, fairly talented individual. They're
Mm.
looking to, whether it's in CrossFit or whatever type of sport, they're looking to, make it to, the elite level, essentially push over that barrier to get them in to professional work in that industry. What do you do with that athlete to shrink the black box to, we already talked a little bit about it, how you structure their training, but maybe some of the testing that you throw out, one of the things that you want to understand about the athlete.
Yeah, totally. So anytime I've started working with a new athlete, they're never a blank slate. They're coming from another program or another coach. So the first thing that I do is I try and identify where are the big gaps in their training right now. So what are things that I know they're doing that just don't really make sense, or what are things I think they really should be doing? And I make the minimum number of changes to their program as possible. So I'll literally take the program that another coach wrote for them and put them on, and I'll just start modifying that over time. Because, for example, if this athlete's telling me I really need to get stronger, and we identify, hey, that is the case, you need to get stronger, well, let's look at the strength protocols they're doing. Instead of me starting from scratch, how do we modify what they're doing to see if we could start spurring some progress? And I'll start building on what they're doing. My idea is we should always be making the minimum number of changes at once. If I take this new athlete and I just start them with a bespoke program from scratch and they start doing phenomenal when they were plateaued for the past 6 months, I have no idea why they're getting better now. And now I've got a runaway train where I'm like, man, this athlete's doing great. I don't know why they're doing great. And inevitably they're going to plateau. And I have no idea what I'm going to change because I don't know what made them better. So a lot of it is that it's just making very small changes and really trying to isolate what is working, why it's working, what isn't working, and then you could get nuanced with that over time. The other thing is just layering on very simple data analysis. I'm not talking about applying machine learning with athletes or doing anything crazy. Even just understanding how to calculate a correlation between different measurements could be really useful for an athlete. So to give a really easy case, using NEARS, you could look at rates of oxygen utilization.
Mhm.
Well, what does that really do for performance? Well, maybe I want to improve an athlete's maximum speed and power. And over 20 weeks, I record their max power output and I record their maximum rate of oxygen utilization. And I might see that those things are perfectly linearly correlated to each other. Now I know something really important about that athlete. If I ever need to get them more powerful over time, I know improving their maximal rate of oxygen utilization is more than likely going to have that effect. That's just one example, but you could see how that could work in other instances. You could also look at rolling averages of certain important key performance indicators and see how those are trending over time.
Mhm.
So earlier we talked about misapplications of capturing training data. One of the big ones is people don't understand regression towards the mean. The time when you are most likely to regress is after having your biggest breakthrough. People don't
Mhm.
think about it that way, but if you hit a 5 kilogram snatch PR, Well, the next time you test a 1 rep max snatch is when you are most likely to not improve.
Yeah.
And a lot of times athletes will test again and they might go down 2.5 kilos and they're like, my training's not doing anything. It's like, no, no, no. Let's think about this. You had a 5 kilogram PR and now you tested again 2 weeks later and you're down 2.5 kilograms. You're still 2.5 kilos up from the beginning of the cycle. That's an
Yeah.
improvement. So if you could look at rolling averages of measurements over time, that wipes out the impact of any given outlier, whether it's a really bad day or a really good day. And then you're not making decisions based off of outlier data points. So these are really easy things that coaches can do that don't really take a lot of time. And it could essentially make sure that you're not making decisions based off of emotions, making decisions off of bad data, or just changing too many things at once where you don't really know what's working. And then you could take some nice, easy notes over time. When an athlete does plateau, you could look back through your notes and have a pretty good idea of what you end up changing. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. When I learned that I didn't need to reinvent the wheel and always give athletes something novel, it made my programs work better and it was way less stressful for me because I didn't feel like I always had to invent something and just use creativity to come up with a new training protocol when I could just give someone the same thing they were doing last week and I could say, this isn't me being lazy. This is genuinely what's going to be effective.
Yeah. That's actually really good. And I don't think people realize that much is anytime you see dramatic shifts in training, that's a very opportune time for injury or sickness to interject. Like when you see these dramatic shifts in whether it's load, whether it's, variations of stimulus, different positions, you're generally going to overload the athlete because the stimulus has changed so much. Their body now has to kind of recalculate, okay, these are the demands for me to survive, right? Completely different than the other week. So that adds a lot of stress. And that gradual shift is something that I just don't think a lot of people think about, especially when taking on a new athlete, right? It's super important. So this is one question that I don't really like it a lot, but I just like to hear the thought process around it. Like I don't really care about I like to hear the thought process around it because it kind of gives me more information. So there's no one best test out there. There's no one best physiological test, performance test. But let's just stick to physiology because I'm interested in some of the markers and how you use them. But we know that if we get more tests, it gives us more data. But if you could only choose one test, whether it's, let's say you're limited by money and you just wanted to use one test and become the master at it and publish, the next 20 years of research on breakthrough of this test and find all these underlying factors. What would that test be? Let's just say you're using it for 3 to 5 years. Let's just say with a CrossFitter, what would that, physiological test be and why?
Oh God. Man, it's a hard one because I'm like something like VO2 max, it's so simple and it is such a useful test, but it's only useful in a limited number of circumstances where I'm like, well, critical power could be used for pacing, it could be used to prescribe training. And then I think about critical metabolic rate, which we had gone back and forth on via email, and I'm like, well, that's not modality specific. Oh, I had to pick one. I think I would pick I'm going to say critical power, but I'm going to flex the definition of that and say not modality specific. So if I could have critical power on the varying modalities, and maybe I'm going to cheat and say that includes like critical power on a lift as well. I think that would just give you so much precision with training, and it gives you the ability to predict performance in a way that something like VO2 max can't. And this is assuming I'm not the one that needs to actually capture all of that data because that's a pain. If it's just provided to me on a week-to-week basis, I have nice dashboards giving me critical power. That's definitely the one I would pick if it could only be one.
Nice. Yeah, I like your thinking on that because it does give a really good profile. I mean, VO2 max, right? For people that don't know, people think VO2 max is just this number that's spit out to them, and that's what the VO2. The real beauty in the VO2 max is for a simple test, you capture a lot of information, right? You capture transition points. You capture how people's physiology is trending in certain portions of the test. It does give you the VOMAX. It does give you these capacities as well, but it's realistically just giving you a profile. It's a profile in the physiological realm, where you get in these hard data and this is where I'm really interested. I got a podcast coming up with a guy. We're going to discuss this quite in depth, I believe. Is some of these hard metrics like power are starting to kind of take the place of some of these physiological metrics. And I obviously know that's a huge oversimplification, but some of these softwares that are coming out, like Inside, I don't know if you've heard of them,
Yep.
or there's some other guys that have kind of offshooted, softwares of that. They're really starting to WKO5. They're really starting to grasp the connections between the physiology in the lab and what those profiles look in these hard metrics like power.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to see power profiles from whatever test and match them to use data science to match these and find the underlying factors, underlying connections, you're going to find something there. And when these guys have come out with this stuff, it's not just on a whim. They're coming out with it after a long time of spending time comparing data and understanding the relationships between them. So obviously we know that it doesn't take the place of a VO2 max test, but I think that's cool that you said that, because I think Phil Skiba would be proud of you, because I think like he's such a big proponent of how useful this critical power is, because it's giving you a really good, hard metric, but also that applies really, really well to this physiological realm as well, and understanding the profile. But
yeah, well, anything I could do to make Phil Skiba proud of me, I know I'm on the right direction.
Yeah. So one of the other things I want to touch on here is central or peripheral. So like whether it's listening to webinars of different people, conferences, or research, a lot of the times I hear researchers or scientists come out and say like it's central. People that think it's peripheral are crazy, or people that think it's central or have lost their mind. And you kind of already spoke to this before, so I think I know where the answer is going to go. But just maybe to elaborate a little bit, why do you think this question is kind of lost some nuance to it?
Yeah, so one, I'm going to start by saying both for some people, central for other people, and then peripheral for a third group. I think it could be any of the above. I think the reason why this is so contentious, about 2 years ago, I published a paper. I don't even remember a journal it was in, but the paper is titled "Weak Beliefs Strongly Held: Challenging Conventional Paradigms of Maximal Exercise Performance." And I basically went through the history of VO2 max research and argued the point that VO2 max is not principally determined by stroke volume, which is the current belief in physiology. And I traced back the roots of where that belief came from. When Archibald Hill first came up with this VO2 max concept, he made some back of the napkin calculations. He said, at the end of maximal effort exercise, venous oxygen levels will be between 10 and 30% saturated. Arterial oxygen levels will be about 95 to 99% saturated. And then with his calculations, and he said, thus, basically VO2 max has to be limited by the central systems, because the arteriovenous oxygen concentration difference, the difference between oxygen sat in your arterial venous blood, is already about as wide as it could get. And VO2 max is determined by cardiac output multiplied by that difference. Therefore, cardiac output has to be the thing that creates the inter-individual differences. Everyone took that at face value. For about 70 years after that, everyone was just trying to prove that true, which isn't good science. They would say, oh, hemoglobin mass and concentration explains inter-individual differences between people's VO2 max, which is true. Males have greater blood volume and hemoglobin mass and concentration than females. That accounts for differences in VO2 max. Adults are greater than children. That also accounts for these differences. Inter-individual differences in stroke volume matter as well. But what people neglected is that Archibald Hill came up with those figures of venous and arterial oxygen saturation at the end of exercise. The dude couldn't measure either of those things because the technology didn't exist for 50 years later. So everyone just took it at face value that those were actual values, and you see them cited in literature over and over. I tracked down over 100 papers that cited Archibald Hill and use that to justify VO2 max being principally limited by stroke volume and cardiac output. Well, it turns out that Archibald Hill got the math wrong, and also that he was just wrong in those measurements. Arterial oxygen saturation differs drastically at the end of exercise, as does venous. And this is where it opens up the door for there being other limitations. Some people can't utilize oxygen effectively in the periphery. So if they improve oxygen extraction in the tissue, they widen the arteriovenous gap and their VO2 max goes up. That's in support of an oxygen utilization limitation. There's other individuals like Peter Snell, former world record mile holder, where he had such great arterial oxygen desaturation from a pulmonary diffusion limitation, like we talked about earlier, that he was limited by pulmonary system function. That's another limitation for VO2 max. So the more you look into the literature, and if you basically ignore Archibald Hill's back of the napkin calculations, you realize there's actually a lot of different limitations for VO2 max. And it's really not hard to spot these either. When you just test a dozen different athletes, you'll very clearly see that they have different limitations.
Oh, 100%. Like, I just think about how many athletes that compete on a high level that have asthma. You know what I mean? Like, over the years, how many I've seen, and it's like, yeah, getting your VO2 max higher is, what we want, but probably one of the better ways to try and set that ground to do that is fixing your respiratory capacity and capabilities, right? And it's like, people just focus on these very niche things, but gotta take all things into account. That's another thing too. Like, you were probably one of the first person. Yeah, I think you were the first. Yeah, I think it was. I'd learned about breathing a long time ago from some of these Russian things that I was into in combat sports, and understanding just essentially the cadence of breath, manipulating your breath for your psychology. Not just, biochemically, but biochemically will manipulate your psychology as well, right? We obviously understand that. But they were big on manipulating the cadence and little tiny breath holds while doing anyways, they're way further ahead than a lot of people and stuff when it comes to psychology. And yeah, anyway, so what I was getting to was, you spent a lot of time when you're discussing obviously the education around NEARS is explaining to people why the respiratory system has such an integrative, reach when it comes to an athlete, whether it's on your VO2 max, whether it's on your, anyways, so just that one little aspect that people never even take into consideration. They think, respiratory training is some book you read about how not to overbreathe or whatever it is they come to in the most, new pop sci book. But they really miss the basic anatomy and physiology of what is required to have a high VO2 max, or what is required to have performance. Well, you need a properly functioning pulmonary system, and the cardiac system connects to that. So maybe, all these things that we see with, cardiac adaptations are a proxy of that too, right? What's going on in the lungs. Anyways, getting way down in these weird rabbit holes, and I don't have too much time left here. So let's so I just wanted to give you a shout out there, is because I think many people miss that basic aspect when talking about central and peripheral. They don't understand that everyone's coming to it from a different place. Like, there's so much to dig out. So last question is, I'd like to understand, like, some of the interests you have outside of sports performance, some of the stuff that you might read outside of sports performance, or some of the stuff that you like to do outside of, all this stuff. And I know that you're not super focused on it now with your new job, but maybe stuff outside of the physiology realm.
Yeah. So, like academic fields, I'm really interested in computational biology, which is essentially just applying modern data science techniques to biology. So It's related to sports performance in a sense.
Mhm.
I think as different wearable technologies get better, it will be even more so. That's definitely a big interest of mine. And outside of that, just dabbling in a lot of different areas. I don't have any particular topics that overly obsessed with, but I
Yeah.
really like getting exposed to different ideas from different disciplines. And I've just found that a lot of the creativity that I've been able to have in sports performance and ideas I've come up with are usually completely unrelated to sports performance at their origin. It might be
Mhm.
environmental biology book that I read or
Mhm.
economics book I read, and you find that people that are innovative in any given field, a lot of things that they come up with, you could probably bring it back to what you're most interested in.
Yeah.
So I just try to spend a lot of time reading as many different disciplines as I can.
Yeah, I think that's lost today. Is like over specialization, whether that's in sport, whether that's in careers where people just hone in on this one thing. Like the old Renaissance man is kind of lost. Where, like
Yeah.
I hear some of these guys, like he was a cardiologist, he spoke 5 languages, he
Mm.
was built several houses around. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
these people used to do everything. Like you never, it's so rare to hear people that branch out into different spaces. People get really hyper focused, and it's easy to do that with the access to information that we have now, right? Like you can really hone in on just one thing and drill down. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's funny because you actually you turned me on to one guy that super Rob Dunn. I heard you in a podcast a while ago. I think it was like maybe a year ago, and you spoke on this. He's a microbiologist, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. And some of his work, I read 2 of his books now. So interesting because within those books, he pulls so many different fields of study into this,
Yeah.
you know, this one concept of how this certain thing is so applicable to our lives, whether it's the, dirt that we have in our house and maybe you shouldn't sweep your floor or whatever it is, or,
Yeah.
the pronghorns and you know what I mean? Anyway,
Yep.
it's just great is so interesting. The books really take yourself out of this hyper specialization, process of, oh, the best way to learn about something is just to spend 40 hours a week reading that thing.
Yeah, and even just I mean, Rob Dunn's books are phenomenal for anyone who hasn't read them. Like even just some of the ideas in there, things that you're positive you know to be true. You're like, oh, parasites are terrible, and you read
Yeah.
his books and you're like,
Yeah.
man, parasites being entirely missing from the human body might not be the best thing.
Yeah.
And it just raises all sorts of interesting things. And you could go down that rabbit hole and read about it for weeks and come out in
Oh
some
yeah.
weird ways that you didn't expect.
Yeah, that did actually, because I went down the Helminth and all this other stuff. I went
Yeah.
down the research that it's yeah, that stuff is it's so interesting. So yeah, man, this has been a great conversation. Like really, we touched on a lot of different things. Love to have you on again at some point because I really like to dig into some of this stuff, especially around genetics too. Like we didn't have a ton of time to really dig into some of these things, but so where can people find you at?
Yeah, so best place to find me, post most of my content on Instagram. It's just my name with an underscore, so Evan underscore Peikon. In the next few weeks, you'll probably see more information coming out on my company's platform as well, which is NNOXX underscore Inc. INC. We're finally going to start putting out information on some of the things that we've been developing for the past year. Right now, there's no
Nice.
information available on that, so I'm pretty excited for that.
Nice. Nice. Yeah. Awesome. And if you still have that you still have that Substack up, right? Like if people
Yeah,
haven't found
the
you there.
Substack is still live. All the
Yeah.
articles are there. I just don't post anything new on that anymore, and that's the Emergent Performance Lab Substack.
Yeah. Yeah. Check that out, guys. Cause if especially for CrossFitters too, right? There's a lot of gold in there.
Yeah.
Any athlete in general, really. Really good stuff. So yeah, man. Thanks a lot for coming on today. And we'll catch you later, folks.